All right, now we're recording. So all of that was just a freebie for you guys. So in the Torah, how is Yom Kippur commemorated? What are some of the rituals? What do people do? We see it in the Mahzor. The Mahzor includes that, a lot of them, all of them probably. What are the rituals that are associated with Yom Kippur in the Torah?
We have this goat that we send out into the desert.
Okay, so we have the goat that we sent out to Azazel. The word from hell actually comes from Azazel. So one of the rituals of Yom Kippur are the 2 scapegoats. The priest brings the scapegoats, puts his hands on both of the heads of the scapegoats. One is designated to take all the sins of Israel onto itself, and then that goat is sent away into the wilderness. It's killed, and the belief is that all of the sins of Israel are atoned for by putting the goats, sending this goat away. What else?
I should know this.
Right. Okay. But luckily I do. So the other, some of the other things are, let's look at the Torah reading for Yom Kippur for a moment, and I will give you that page in a second. So let's look at page 545. So this is the ritual of the scapegoat, and we'll look at just the second aliyah. Aaron shall take the 2 he-goats and let them stand before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and he shall place lots upon the 2 goats, one marked for the Lord and the other marked for Azazel. Aaron shall bring forward the goat designated by the lot for the Lord, which he is to offer as a sin offering, while the goat designated by lot for Azazel shall be left standing alive before the Lord to make expiation with it and to send it off into the wilderness for Azazel. And then as you go on, it goes on. Let's look at the 3rd aliyah, and we'll look at the second paragraph of the 3rd aliyah. Thus he shall purge the shrine of the uncleanliness and transgressions of the Israelites, whatever their sins, and he shall do the same for the tent of meeting, which abides with them in the midst of their uncleanness. When he goes in to make expiation in the shrine, nobody else shall be in the tent of meeting until he comes out. So there's 2 things that are actually going on according to the Torah reading. One is cleansing Israel of its sins by sending the goat with the sins, killing the goat with the sins. But the other big thing in the Torah reading is the idea that the tabernacle itself has to be cleansed of its impurities. So the tabernacle is the Mishkan, right, in the desert, that the children of Israel use as the center of their worship. Later on, it becomes the temple. But why is it important that the Mishkan, that the tabernacle is purified? Why is that important? And it's not Pesach, it's not a spring cleaning. Why is it important in biblical theology to have a purified tabernacle, do you think?
Well, because they're making an appeal to God, and Aaron's going in to talk to God.
Right, exactly. And the assumption is if God can only be in a place that's purified. So if there is any impurities in the tabernacle, God's not going to show up. Now, this is a very sort of anthropomorphic idea of God, but it does say in the Torah that the children of Israel are told to build a tabernacle so that God will dwell amongst them. So God can't dwell in a place that's full of impurities, and the place gets full of impurities because the people are sinners, and so the temple itself has to be cleansed. And then we have the very long section, the Avodah service. This is for people that stay late into Musaf. If you look at the Avodah service, starting on page 638. And there's a whole ritual of what the high priest needs to do to prepare for Yom Kippur. So we're told that in the middle of the tabernacle, or in the middle then of the temple in Jerusalem, stands the Holy of Holies. The center of the tabernacle is the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and only is the high priest only does this on Yom Kippur itself. And then there's a very elaborate ritual of how the high priest prepares, and there is an assumption that if the high priest does this wrong, the high priest will die. And one of the things that I compare this to a lot when I talk about trying to understand this is Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? In Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're looking for the tabernacle, right, that stands in the Holy of Holies. And if the wrong person touches it when they find it, what happens to him? He like burns up, right? He's destroyed. So I hate to say it, but really that's sort of the biblical view, that if you go into the Holy of Holies and you are not prepared in the right way, you will die. And the reason that the rabbis understand it that way is because in the Torah portion of Achrei Mot in Leviticus, that's what happens to Aaron's sons. And actually the Torah reading for Yom Kippur is lifted right out of Achrei Mot. So, but we don't read that part on Yom Kippur, but right prior to the ritual, we've already read, in the weekly parsha, that the sons of Aaron offer a strange fire and they're killed. So the understanding is that it's really dangerous to come in contact with this kind of holiness without the right preparation. So the high priest has a ritual, and he goes through the whole ritual, and he confesses first his own sins, and then he confesses the sins of all of the priests, and then he confesses the sins of all of Israel. And each time when he comes out alive, the children of Israel fall on their faces and say, Baruch Shem Kavod Le'olam Va'ad, blessed is God for allowing him to have lived. And the understanding is that if he's gone through this whole ritual and he's lived, that the people are forgiven. Every single Jewish holiday has its basis in animal sacrifice. Every holiday is centered around the temple ritual. Pesach, you bring the paschal sacrifice to the, first to the Mishkan and then later to the temple. Yom Kippur, Shavuot, we read all about the first fruits, and also Shabbat. Shabbat, you have sacrifices that are given. You sacrifice every day, and on Shabbat there's a double sacrifice. So all of the whole worship is centered in the world of sacrifice. But what happens is that the temple's destroyed, and the second temple is destroyed for the second time. The temple is destroyed for the second time in 70 of the Common Era. And that begins the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. And in Rabbinic Judaism, they need to decide what happens with no temple. One of the, choices could have been, well, it's all over, right? Judaism is all over. We can't really fully ever celebrate Judaism without the temple. So, what can we actually do? It's a shame, the punishment, and that's it. But the rabbis begin to develop ritual, moving away from the temple as the center and into something else. And Yom Kippur, we see very dramatically how it moves into something else. So in the Torah, it tells us how do we as individuals, how are we supposed to celebrate Yom Kippur? It uses the phrase that we're supposed to afflict our souls. And then the question is, what does that mean, actually? And the rabbis interpret it to mean that we fast on Yom Kippur. It is not clear that people fasted on Yom Kippur when the temple was standing. That becomes something that comes a little bit later on. But what the rabbis decided to do in compiling the Mahzor was to take all of these pieces of the sacrificial system and to include them in the Mahzor, to remind us that this is the way that it was done. But guess what? Instead of doing it, we're just going to read about it. And one of the classic examples of that is in the Haggadah, where we're Pesach was celebrated by sacrificing the Paschal lamb. And Rabban Gamliel says what you have to do to celebrate Pesach is to mention it. Right? We say Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. You have to talk about that. And I always imagine, you know, probably in the first generation, people were like, what are you talking about? Like, you have to do it. But we can't do it. And he said, no. You know, you just have to talk about it. You just have to remember it. And so our Mahzor on Yom Kippur is filled with the memory of how what Yom Kippur was like when the temple was still standing. And, you know, I find that meaningful, right? That we're remembering rituals that are 3,000 years old, that we're remembering how our ancestors celebrated. But I think without all of that background, I'm not sure how meaningful it is to the average person when we're reading the Torah and they're reading about this goat that was sent out into the wilderness. I'm not sure, like, you know, okay, that may be interesting. Yechiel Pupko wrote something once about the Haggadah, which I loved, which was we meet all of these different rabbis in the Haggadah and we learn about their Seder. So we see what Rabban Gamliel did at his Seder, and we see what, you know, Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis of Bnei Brak talked about at their Seder, and we learn about, you know, the Hillel and the Hillel sandwich and what he did at his Seder. And I think when you look at it that way, it adds this unbelievable meaning. Like, we're very fortunate that we can learn about what these people did 2,000 years ago, because wouldn't you love to know, like, what your great-great-grandparents did at their Seder? Like, wouldn't that be really cool if we could know that? And of course we can't. I mean, unless you're very lucky and you have, you know, an illustrious family tree and lots of things passed down. But for most of us, we would be lucky if we could trace our family, you know, before our great-grandparents. I mean, that would be, you know, I actually know very little about my great-great-grandparents. I know a little bit about them, but I don't know what their Seder looked like. So the Mahzor is actually in many ways doing the same thing. It's giving us different generations and showing us how they celebrated Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur is celebrated in the Bible or in the Torah through ritual sacrifice. But now let's look at what the prophets were concerned with, because they have a very different concern. So let's look at page 555. Now, you need to understand also part of the rabbis never reject the idea of animal sacrifice as a means to atone for sin. They never reject sacrifice. Now, Christianity has a different relationship to sacrifice, and Christianity feels that sacrifice is obsolete. The rabbis have a different, you know, a bit of a different relationship with it, which is if it comes, they probably maybe would have been happy if it had come back, but they don't reject it. They say that you actually, in the prophets also, talk about you need sacrifice, but very soon there's this realization in prophetic Judaism that there's a problem with the system of sacrifice. There's an inherent problem built into the system. And that inherent problem built into the system is that people can bring sacrifices forever without a change of heart. And that's a problem, right? That's a real problem. You know, you cheat and you steal, and then you bring, you know, your goat, and then you go out and you cheat and steal and you bring your goat. And the Torah doesn't really talk about that kind of a person. The Torah makes the assumption that after you bring your sacrifice, you're forgiven for your sins because you've atoned. But you could be somebody that cheats. And so that becomes a real problem and a breakdown in the system. So already the prophets begin to talk about that as a problem. And in the amazingly beautiful Haftarah for Yom Kippur, which is on page 555, God asked in the third paragraph, cry with a full throat. We'll go to the next paragraph after that. To be sure, they seek me daily, eager to learn my ways, like a nation that does what is right, that has not abandoned the laws of its God. They ask me for the right way. They're eager for the nearest of God. And they say, why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? So even fasting can be false, right? Even without a sacrificial system, you can fast all day, you can beat your chest, and you can say, why isn't God listening to my prayers? I'm doing the rituals that were prescribed. And this is what Isaiah says. Because on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your laborers. Right? Like you're in synagogue, beating your chest and hungry, and certain people aren't getting paid for the work that they did, and we'll just leave that political comment standing there. Because you fast in strife and contention, right? I'm on the Bima, so I generally don't have a chance to get into arguments with my family. But I won't say that it's never happened on Yom Kippur but that, feeling of like, you're trying to create this sort of perfect experience and then, real life intrudes. But in any case, your fasting today is not such to make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast I read this every year out loud to congregations. I just love this so much. Is this the fast I desire? A day for people to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast, a day when the Lord is favorable? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock feathers of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke, is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to offer clothing and not to ignore your own kin. So Isaiah realizes already built within the ritual is this real problem that, you can make a big drama out of your sacrifice, and now fasting is your sacrifice. You can make a big drama out of it. But if you don't realize that other people, you're fasting, we all have the unbelievable privilege of fasting voluntarily. And I don't know what percentage of the world, but it's a really high percentage of the world is fasting involuntarily. They're not going home at the end of being hungry all day and, having a big meal. And if your hunger doesn't sensitize you to the hunger of others, then according to Isaiah, this was all for nothing. But the interesting thing and where it differs with Christianity is Christianity made the decision you don't need any of these rituals anymore. You need to care about the poor. You need to feed the hungry. Christianity certainly believes very strongly in that. But they feel that Christianity's theology is that you don't need the ritual anymore. And the prophets really don't say that. The prophets say you really need both, right? You need to be fasting. You need to be cognizant of the ritual. But at the same time, this ritual needs to sensitize you to the needs of others. And I feel, I keep saying this over and over for those of us that are regularly on Shabbat services at this time of year, every week Deuteronomy is a sermon on hearing the voices of those in need. The whole book of Deuteronomy is basically about hearing the cries of others, hearing those that are less fortunate than you, making sure that you take care of those in need. And so even on this Yom Kippur day where you are in somewhat of a bubble. I don't know if you feel that way. I certainly feel that way. I'm at services all day. I'm not reading the newspaper. I'm not out. For me, really, other than going home at night and going to bed, I come back the next morning. I'm there all day long, and I'm totally oblivious to anything other than the experience of what's happening in that room, and I'm fully immersed. But Isaiah tells us if that's all you are, and you don't use this to go forward, you've missed the whole point of the day. But the rabbis actually take it one step even further than that, because really, you are supposed to come out of that day feeling that you've atoned, and that you've been cleansed, and that you've been forgiven. And actually, it's the Day of Atonement atones for your sins. But there's a glitch in that system, right? That system also has a glitch, which is not any different than the glitch in the whole sacrificial system, which is you can go through the whole day, you can admit all your sins, you can fast, you can, realize everything that you did wrong, and then what happens the next day?
You go back to your old ways.
Right. So the Mishnah actually says specifically that you can't say, I'm going to sin, and then I'll atone on Yom Kippur. Like the rabbis are very, because just like there were people that could be like, all right, I'm going to cheat and I'll bring my sacrifice and the score will be even, that the rabbis take it one step further and say, you can't do that with Yom Kippur. You can't sin and repent and sin and repent and sin and repent. You have to have a change of heart. There has to be some sort of internal process. And so it's the rabbis that begin then to develop the idea that Yom Kippur only atones for the sins between God and human beings. That's it. So, bad news people, that means violating Shabbat and violating the holidays and not keeping kosher. Those would be the kinds of things that are sins between God and people, according to our tradition. But what do you have to do between the sins between people and people?
Apologize.
You have to apologize, right? You have to take responsibility and you have to apologize. And you're supposed to actually be doing it before you show up for Yom Kippur, right? Like now would be the time. The rabbis actually, because they love to systemize everything. So the question is, what happens if you apologize and the person doesn't accept your apology? Because, that could happen. So anybody know what you have to do?
I think you have to try 3 times.
Exactly. 3 times. Now, I have to say, I would give a lot of credit to the person that shows up a second time, and certainly a third time. Takes an awful lot of humility. But you have to try 3 times. If that person then doesn't forgive you, the sin is on their head. Right? The sin is on their head because they're supposed to forgive you. Now, the rabbis don't really talk or recognize the idea that there are just some things that a person can't actually apologize for. And I don't mean, I shared on the Rosh Hashanah seminar about Simon Wiesenthal in the book, The Sunflower, that when he is a prisoner of war during the Holocaust, he's called to the bed of a SS officer who wants to ask his forgiveness for having killed Jews. And Simon Wiesenthal, after he's older, after he's released and is older, he asks a lot of theologians about what his response should have been. And Jewish theologians are across the board. You cannot forgive somebody for something they did to somebody else. That he would have to, the only people that can forgive him are his victims. But that's not what I mean. I don't think the rabbis, I don't think they realized what a really abusive parent was, or sexual abuse. I think there were crimes that they didn't, even really talk about. And in the new rabbinical assembly Mahzor, which we don't use, but it's a beautiful Mahzor, there's actually at Yizkor, there is a prayer for an abusive parent.
Really?
I don't have Mahzor at home with me. It's a very powerful prayer. Because everybody around you is saying Yizkor for, what we assume to be loving and wonderful parents. And let's say you're standing there and to say conflicted. And it doesn't say what kind of abuse. It just says abusive. So it could have been, a difficult parent, or it could have been, a violent, dangerous. It's fill in the blank. It's your experience. But it's a prayer for a parent that's died, that's been, a very difficult or abusive, to sort of recognize that in the tradition you're supposed to say something, but you're certainly not in a position, you don't want to be in a position to say what everybody else is around you is saying. And I thought it was in a really, this move that we really is very important to us now, to think about inclusion, right? And how we include people. And I think the rabbis had I mean, I don't think people talked about these things, so I can't imagine they didn't know those things existed. But I think that they viewed people as sort of a much more common experience that was much more circumspect than our understanding of the vast varieties of human experience and human suffering. So the rabbis were very concerned that people would go through Yom Kippur as like, you know, I did it, I'm done. And so they devised this system that, you know, you have to apologize. You have to apologize for your sins. And then only then, you know, could you be forgiven, and that God doesn't get involved in those things. And so it's a really interesting, I think, juxtaposition in Yom Kippur and the High Holiday Mahzor. I mean, I started out by talking about like us, like throwing ourselves on God's mercy and begging for our lives. And at the same time, the Mahzor believes very strongly in human agency. And taking responsibility and the things that we can do and that we have to do and that we should do. So there's sort of these two things, kind of these two tracks happening at once, you know, of this, I would say both a sort of pessimistic view that if God doesn't step in and save us, you know, we're in really big trouble. And yet at the same time, this very optimistic view that as human beings, we can affect change in the world, and we must affect change in the world. And we actually have an incredible ability to, you know, feed the hungry and clothe the naked and make the world a better place and take responsibility and change and apologize and mend relationships. I mean, you know, people can be somewhat skeptical about those things, about the question about, can anybody really change? Can you really change? And how much can you really change? And, you know, is it years of therapy? And what is it that actually affects change? But the Mahzor, for all of its sort of negativity, also has this very positive idea about what human beings can and should be doing in the world. And one of the words that repeats itself over and over and over, and there's a whole prayer about it, and we sing it, is Hayom, right? Again, near the end, if you don't stay for Musaf, you miss it. But there is this refrain, like Hayom, that today, like, you know, long before the phrase, today is the first day of the rest of your life. This idea, like, you know, or as Hillel would say, if not now, when, right? This is the day, this is the time, you know, we can do it, you can do it, we're going to do it together, we're going to do it as a community, which is a very optimistic, I think, view of sort of this utopian vision of what the world could actually be, in the face of the real fear that, you know, we don't know what's going to come in the next year. And it could be anything, and it could be really bad. I saw this piece today. Dan was showing me this piece on PBS. I kind of mixed feelings about it. It was a newscaster who was talking about 12 years ago, her 42-year-old husband was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And her best self was the 7 months that she nursed him until he died. And I turned to Dan and I said, don't count on it. Like, she's a hero. It's like, just don't count on it. But she talked about, like, this was her best self. And then she said something that sort of struck me, and I wondered if maybe because she's not Jewish. She said, you know, after that experience, I really felt like, what is there to be scared of? The worst has already happened. And I was like, oh my God. You know, I think there's, you know, what are you talking about? There's tons of things you could still be scared about. Like, things could always be worse. So I think the Mahzor has that flavor. Like, things could be worse, but there is sort of this sense of how do we appreciate what we have if we take it all for granted. So I want to just pause there if anybody has any, you know, sort of questions, comments about anything up until this point.
I just had a question on why so much time is spent and so much detail on these old rituals, rather than just saying, this is what was done, take a page, here's what's done. But I think because it doesn't feel relevant. That I think that there would be more relevant things that we could be doing with our time at services to help ourselves move forward than looking at these old rituals.
I can't say that I disagree with you about that. You know, it's an interesting question of, like, in the Cantor, like, how to make, like, the Avodah service is the service that's all about, you know, what the high priest did. You know, you're bringing a reading or you're bringing an explanation, but it's an interesting question to just think about. Not for this year, it's too late. Just abbreviating the whole thing and not doing as much of it. You know, acknowledging it because you have it in the Torah reading and acknowledging it, but maybe not, you know, I mean, really, I don't know, it's probably not even more than 5 minutes, but it would be, you know, part of the challenge, and I think about this a lot. We don't write on Yom Kippur, and I'm not going to start writing on Yom Kippur, but I sometimes think that if you could write on Yom Kippur, like having everybody have, you know, paper and pencil and write down, you know, what are the things that I'd like to change, what, like to have those sort of like an experience of some meditative idea. And so, you know, part of it is encouraging people to think about doing these things before. And I, you know, maybe one of the things we could do, Judy, next year is, especially with this like lovely technology, is think about, you know, how do we use this technology to encourage people in, you know, like between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or leading up, to think about, you know, these things about themselves, about life, about the world, about their promises that they, you know, about who you're apologizing to. And there may be a way to use this as spiritual preparation.
Yeah, but Rabbi,
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I think that at the high holiday, this drawn out, repetitive cadence is purposeful.
Yeah.
And especially now in the lives that we live, which are so rushed, and we're always multitasking, and we're always on our way to something or on our way back or doing this or doing this. I think that there is a message in the cadence that you have got to stop, slow down, repeat, 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 really is a way of forcing us out of our normal speed everything into a very profound consideration of the issues.
I actually addressed this just a little bit in my, I think my Erev Rosh Hashanah sermon about, not every word is going to be meaningful, but it's not really a problem if people, I mean, I don't want people zoning out and thinking about, you know, their grocery list for tomorrow, though, you know, I have no control over that. People are going to do, your mind goes where it goes. But, you know, one of the things, and I believe, Judy, you also do yoga, but I feel like one of my greatest accomplishments in yoga is not looking at the clock every 5 minutes. Like, it's much bigger than like the fact that I learned how to do a headstand against the wall. Because I'm not, and Shavasana, like in the beginning, like laying there was like torture for me. Like, when can I get up? When can I get up? And learning how to even spend those couple of moments sitting still. So I suppose part of the challenge of asking people is, you know, can you just sit still? If, you know, if something in the liturgy is not something that's really, you know, got your interest right now, can you just close your eyes? Can you meditate? Can you think about, you know, other, you know, what is important to you? You know, I really love the new Mahzor. It's exact, and I think that's what the new Siddur does on Shabbat. Like, it gives us different readings. It gives us the ability, if something in the prayer isn't reaching us, to read an explanation or to read a poetic interpretation that allows us to sort of think and refocus. But it takes a lot of kind of self-discipline to do that when the liturgy is not providing it. And I do understand that it's a challenge. And part of the challenge for me, too, is that a lot of people leave after the sermon and they miss all of this other stuff. And I actually have been talking to the cantor about, especially not on Rosh Hashanah, but on Yom Kippur, like, what if I just move the sermon later in the service? Like, people miss these beautiful choir pieces. And
there would be pitchforks.
Well, I'd be a little, well, I said to him, is it worth it? Like, some people will be mad. And I feel
They
like,
would.
why should you be mad? Like, first of all, the sermon actually comes earlier on Yom Kippur because there's no shofar service and the Haftarah is shorter. So it really wouldn't be later. It would just be at a different part of the service. But by the clock, it would be probably about the same time as Rosh Hashanah. But is it worth aggravating people and holding them hostage? So the cantor was like, maybe we just have to accept that not everybody wants the same thing. And some people, they want to leave. Yeah. So I don't know. So we're leaving it the same this year. I don't know, Judy, maybe when you're president, we'll change it and you can keep up. But on the other hand, if you never try anything different, then, I feel like people miss some of the most beautiful choir pieces because they leave before Musaf. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I feel like if we expose them to the beauty of Musaf, maybe they would actually gain something. So I'm toying with the idea, not for this year, but I'm toying with the idea for the future. But I do want to look at one other piece of Yom Kippur. I feel like it'd almost be remiss without talking about what for many people, much, much, much more than any of the sacrifices, but for many people, the most important part of the service, hands down, is not the rabbi's sermon. It's not the beautiful cantor and choir. It is Yizkor. It is the number one call that we get. I mean, now it's in the tickets, but what time is Yizkor? And you have people that come, if they come for nothing else, they come for that. Right. As a matter of fact, we do Yizkor at the very end of the service on Yom Kippur after before the afternoon program. There are congregations that do Yizkor at like 4 or 5 o'clock, so people will come back for Mincha. So truthfully, this shows my priority. I'd rather have them stay through the end of the service than come back for Mincha. If Mincha is small, I'd rather Mincha is small and that they stay for the whole, service in the morning. But it's the anchor, right? It's the anchor for many congregations because it's by far the most important piece. And until I became a rabbi, it was of a great mystery to me what was actually in Yizkor. Because in our tradition, it's a custom, it's not a law, but by custom, people don't stay for Yizkor if their parents are alive. And there's no reason that you cannot stay for Yizkor. And but any plea that you make for people, like you can stay in and please stay in and you don't have to leave for Yizkor, everybody ignores it and they go. Particularly if their parents are with them. They're like, I can't stay in here because my parents will be very upset if I stay in here. So people go and it's fine and people should go. But it's a really fascinating piece because really the actual Yizkor service itself is a couple of readings. It's not like, it's not that big of a mystery. It's a couple of readings. We do Yizkor on other holidays. We also do Yizkor on Pesach and on Shavuot and on Shemini Atzeret, and a fraction of people come to that. And it's kind of an interesting question. I don't really have the answer. Why in so many people's minds, if there's nothing else they do on Yom Kippur or there's no other part of the service that they care about, the unbelievable feeling and connection that they have of a responsibility to do this for their parents, to say Yizkor for their parents. It will be interesting and maybe sad to see if our children or our grandchildren will feel as compelled by it. I suspect not, but we won't be around to know if that's true. But I think that, one of the most dramatic things, and I think, I don't know if this is going to be in the film series, Judy, I can't remember. Are you guys showing The Long Way Home about the DP camps after the Holocaust?
Yeah.
So one of the most moving scenes, so it was a documentary that was done several years ago. It will be part of our film series. It's a very powerful documentary, and I recommend it very, very highly, as all of the documentaries that you guys are showing. It's a great series this year. But there's footage from the first Yom Kippur service after the liberation of the camps in one of the DP camps. And they filmed Yizkor. And so there's footage of this first Yizkor, and it doesn't really say anything. You just see these people, and you know that they're saying Yizkor for probably everybody they ever knew. Like, not everybody, right? Their entire town, their whole family, parents, siblings, children, spouses, everybody. And that sort of has, I don't know, it's a very negative image. It's a very sad image, but it sort of stuck with me. But I see, people cry, people get very emotional. And I think about, as I said, we can't go back that many generations to know what some of these holidays were like for our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. But I think we have a real sense about what it was like for our parents, and maybe if we're lucky enough for our grandparents. And that sort of like with all of the grandiose stuff about we've got God and we've got sacrifice and we've got our commitment to, to make the world a better place. And the most compelling part of it is the connection to our own family and our own family history. So I find that, always very interesting and very, very moving. And what we actually say in Yizkor, which is so Jewish, like this great mystery of this prayer, what we actually say in Yizkor is that we're pledging tzedakah. Like it's so like talk about like maybe it was the earliest Yom Kippur appeal. We're pledging tzedakah in memory of our loved ones to uphold their values. Like there's something so practically Jewish about that, right? Like we're remembering them, and of course it's important that we remember them, but how do we remember them best? By giving tzedakah.
That's so strange.
You think?
Yeah.
I don't know. This is how communities carry on. Like, how do you feed the hungry? How do you, maintain your synagogue? How do you support the state of Israel? And I actually tell bar mitzvah parents this a lot, because a lot of people, they don't talk to their children about money, and so for some parents, they never ever think to talk to their kids about where they make their charitable donations. Like I remember when my in-laws died, and there was a big discussion in the family about where the money should go, right, in their memory, where the money should go. And I said, well, where did your parents donate their money? And I mean, they gasped, right? Well, probably the synagogue, but nobody knew, because nobody had ever talked about it, because, it's not nice to talk about money. So I really encourage, like when I'm with my bat mitzvah families, like tell your kids, like what are the causes that you support and why? Why are they important to you? Are any of those causes that you'd like to see your kids grow up to be involved in? Because if you don't tell them, how are they gonna know? Mm-hmm. So, but it's there's a certain pragmatism to it, right? Like, as you're about to finish Yizkor and you're about to leave Yom Kippur, do not forget to uphold these values in the most concrete way you possibly can, donating money to tzedakah. So, I don't know. That's the Jewish pragmatism in all of this. Like, it's all very theoretical unless you actually do something about it. And there's really, unless you're really, it's actually one of the things I actually love about the Family Promise program that we do with the congregation, because chances are, I'll speak for myself, I highly doubt that I'm ever going to take a homeless person into my home. It's my literal home. Probably never going to happen. Particularly if they're not somehow related to me and I have no other choice. But at the synagogue, we actually take homeless people into our synagogue. And I feel like that's the closest that's the closest any of us will ever get to fulfilling the mitzvah of taking the homeless into our home. And I'm really, really, really proud of us that we do that. So I'm just going to end there. Any other questions, comments?
Rabbi, I have a question and a comment. My question is really a historical one or a technical one. On Yom Kippur, in the Shema and elsewhere, we say out loud, Baruch Shem Kavod, Malkuthel Le'olam Va'ed, and we say that silently every other service. Why the difference? Why do I guess not? Why do we say it out loud on Yom Kippur? More, it's why don't we say it out loud the rest of the year?
Well, the original Baruch Shem Kavod Le'olam Va'ad comes actually from the Avodah service, right? It's put into the Shema. The rest of the Shema is from the Torah, but the insertion after you say Shema Yisrael and then you quietly say Baruch Shem Kavod, that's an insertion into the Shema. So there are a couple reasons. First of all, so the Baruch Shem Kavod is actually from Yom Kippur and the Avodah service, and we actually end with Milah saying that, right, 7 times. Yeah. So it is the phrase of Yom Kippur. So that's why it's said out loud. It's originally from the Yom Kippur service, and that's why we say it out loud. The reason that we don't say it out loud the rest of the year is it's an insertion put into the Shema that breaks up the verses from the Torah. So we don't want to break up the verses from the Torah, lest you think that Baruch Shem Kavod is actually from the Torah. You would give people like, I'm sure nobody really cares that much about it now, but the idea is that you would give people the wrong idea. And the rabbis were somewhat ambivalent about, believe it or not, about inserting certain things into the Siddur. It doesn't seem like they would be ambivalent because they kept putting more and more things in. But there was an ambivalence, but there was a big ambivalence between sticking something in the middle of Torah verses and leading people to believe that it was actually from the Torah when it wasn't. So that's why we don't say it out loud on Shabbat. But Yom Kippur is a
song, right? There's a song where we do it out loud, put in an undertone.
Right. Well, Charlie, I told him, like, you got to have the kids whisper that, because Charlie brought this melody and it's very lovely, but you're supposed to say. Though I will tell you, just as a total aside, when you're like a Jewish law nerd, I have a little bit of a problem with that. Like, it's a beautiful song that they sing the Shema to, but according to the Talmud, according to the Mishnah, you're not supposed to repeat the phrase Shema Yisrael. You're only supposed to say it once. Because in ancient times, the Zoroastrians believed in 2 powers. And so we're saying God is one, but if you say God is one, God is one, there is the problem that you may be doing idol worship by acknowledging 2. So you're only supposed to say it once. So I know it's really not a problem today, and I didn't tell Charlie, like, you can't do that beautiful tune. But I have to say, every time they sing it more than once, I'm like, I think this is actually a violation of Jewish law. Much worse than saying the Baruch Shem out loud. But anyway,
there's something.
Yes.
I can't remember the words right now, but in the Aleinu, there's something that many of the people repeat a couple times.
Oh, Ainod, maybe? Or you mean
yes, and I have heard that same explanation. People who will not repeat that because you should only say it once.
Or is it Ainod means, and there's no else. But if you're like, and there's no else, and no else, and no, you could be talking to more than one, like you would say to your kids, right? I love you the best, and you the best, and you the best. So yeah, sometimes the music, it's a little bit of a stickler for, but so I said, I let those, I hadn't thought about the Elena one, but at the Shema one, I let go. But that's the reason you don't say it out loud on Shabbat. But sort of, there are certain phrases that are like the key, the marks of Yom Kippur. Like I said, Hayom, and the other one is really Baruch Shem Kavod. That again, Rabbi Pupko used to talk about Yom Kippur as the Yontuf of God's name, the holiday, the celebration of God's name, because only the high priest could actually say God's name in the Holy of Holies out loud on Yom Kippur. The Yud Hey Vav Hey, which we don't say, so we say shame, right? We say name in place of that. So we don't actually say God's name, but since Yom Kippur, one of the key pieces of Yom Kippur in the Torah and in biblical Judaism is the high priest calling on God by name. That's why he said it's like the holiday of God's name, and we represent that through using that phrase on Yom Kippur.
Also, your comment about Yizkor.
Yeah.
I grew up Reform, and once I was at the point where I no longer, quote, had to go to services with my family and was completely on my own, the only service I went to before we joined Am Yisrael was Yizkor.
Yeah.
And Yizkor is a much longer service, Reform.
Oh, interesting.
It really includes the Mincha service because you read Jonah.
Interesting. Okay.
It's really the whole Mincha service. What I subsequently learned was the Mincha service with then just as Yizkor, the Yizkor prayers in addition. So you get a real service if you go just to Yizkor and Reform.
You know, I heard a couple of years ago that Cantor Storr from Beth Shalom put together a very powerful, like Yizkor, like a musical, I don't even know what you'd even call it, but he sort of depicted the life of a child growing up into an adult through different musical pieces, and he had people kind of acting it out on the bima. So, you know, first you're a little girl, and then you're a young woman, you know, all the way through an old woman, and I heard it was very beautiful and very powerful and a really incredible way to think about Yizkor and the passing of time, and I would really love to get a copy of it. I don't know if I have the heart to say to Cantor Simon, and now I want you to like put together this whole hour musical program from, you know, for Yizkor on top of everything else that you've done all day. But I thought, like, you know, it might be an incredible thing one year, instead of having like an intellectual speaker in the afternoon, to do a more elaborate piece like that. But I'd really probably maybe have to find other musicians in the congregation and leave poor Cantor Simon alone from having to take on anything else. But I all of this, like, it's like, how can you, you know, make it maybe, you know, come alive, make it more meaningful? Though I don't know if people really would want to stay for a big piece on, you know, when I think the people that want to come for Yizkor are like, they come for Yizkor, and, you know, they've had, though I think most of the people that are there for Yizkor, I think at our congregation have, I don't know if anybody just comes for Yizkor, but they do want to know, and this is actually true on the other holidays as well, is that people call, they want to know what time it's going to be, and for sure on those holidays. We have obviously a much smaller group of people, but those holidays for sure we have people that come just for Yizkor, and then we leave. So, you know, but I should only hope that my children someday, far, 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 far away from now, would feel that sense of wanting to do that, you know, in our memory. I actually am not, I actually think it's quite meaningful and quite beautiful. All right, well, it's 8:30, so thank you all for joining in, and I wish you all a very happy, healthy New Year, Shana Tova, and I'll see you all over the next few days.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome.